Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome to Reinventing Parking. I'm your host, Paul Barter. My guest this time is Patrick Siegman, who is a transportation planner and economist and founding principal of Siegman and Associates, a firm devoted to sustainable transportation planning. He was formerly principal and shareholder at Nelson Nygaard. Patrick has a long record of providing transport and parking expertise and advice in more than 70 citywide and district plans. His work has received awards from several professional bodies, such as the American Planning Association. Welcome to Reinventing Parking, Patrick.
Hi, Paul. It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
What I was thinking is maybe let's just start with a specific example. Can you point to a city or a municipality that you're familiar with that you might call a model of what to do about parking reform, and maybe tell that story briefly?
First, to begin, I should say that there's no one place that I would use as a model for all places. In many ways, there's a host of examples out there, lots of cities that have done good things. And in some ways, the best approach I often find for a city is to find the place that speaks to them, or to find the examples that speak to people in the town where you're working. Because, for example, San Francisco, where I live, has done some really excellent reforms. But on the other hand, people who live in a much smaller town are inclined to say, well, that's San Francisco, that's the big city, that's different. Or they may think that our reforms have succeeded for reasons that have nothing to do with the reality. And they may have the opinion, maybe based on a visit 20 years ago, that, well, things were terrible there when it came to parking. So why would anybody use that example? And nonetheless, it's a really excellent example that has been a model for many, many cities around the world, especially it speaks to the larger ones. If you think about some of the best potential parking reforms that are available for really making cities work better, I think probably the three most important are the three that UCLA professor Donald Shoup calls out. And he's essentially said, look, we've made two big mistakes in parking policy. First, we have kept curb parking either free or cheap. So that is, the spaces on the street tend to be free or cheap, usually for historical reasons. And then we require lots and lots of off-street parking. And both of those things cause real problems. And so he recommends three reforms to overcome that. And he says, first, we ought to charge the right prices for curb parking. And then second, to make that politically popular, we should return the parking revenue back to the blocks where it's generated to help pay for public services. And then he says, if we do those two things, we can remove all of the minimum parking regulations so that people can decide how much parking to build on their own properties. And San Francisco has done two of those three things. We are charging the right prices for curb parking. At least we're doing it a lot of the time in a lot of the places. And we have removed all of the minimum parking regulations so that people can really decide whether they want to build parking at all, or whether they want to build up to at least the maximum that's allowed.
Is that citywide for all land uses?
It is. It's citywide now for all land uses. It's been a long sort of step-by-step process to get there that took place over 20, 25 years or so. First, in downtown San Francisco, the minimum parking requirements were eliminated for all of the non-residential uses. And this was back in the 1980s.
Right. That's a common first step, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. That's really common, especially because cities will often build a network of public garages downtown. But then in the late 90s, there was a gigantic rail yard called Mission Bay. And the rail yards and a lot of other underused areas around it were replanned. And in that plan, they removed virtually all of the minimum parking requirements and decided to let people build as little as they wanted the outcome of that was that it worked well. And so then it expanded from there.
And that was even before the on-street parking reforms that they were called SF Park previously. Are they still called SF Park? That's the demand-based price setting. So minimum parking requirements were eliminated in a significant area even before those reforms.
Yeah, there really were. I mean, Mission Bay was easy in many ways because there were very few. It was a very large area with few neighbors nearby,
Okay.
and I think in many ways there weren't very many people who were nearby, and therefore not many people were worried about it. There might have been one neighborhood association, and I'm not sure whether they even noticed that this was in the plan. It's interesting because sometimes that's how some of the reforms happen is that
Yes.
you do a new plan for an area and you just remove the minimum parking requirements, and unless somebody notices, it just happens, right?
Okay, our new strategy, parking reform by stealth. Yeah, good idea.
Yeah, it's if no one's worried about it, then sometimes it's that easy.
Can you perhaps say a little bit about the value of local advocates and activists of various kinds? I have this vague sense that in the United States, at least, there are transit advocates and bicycle advocates and housing reformers and various others, and they've gradually becoming better informed about parking and how parking is part of their issue, and that gradually that's playing into more and more support when cities do propose some of these kinds of changes. Some of these people then come forward and offer support, and some of them are actually pushing the cities in that direction. Do you have examples of that kind of thing, and has it been helpful in your work?
It has, and I mean, I often find that in working in a town, it's really important to go in and listen first and find out what do people care most about in their town right now. What are the biggest issues, and in some places it will really be that they are really trying to revive their economy. They need more jobs. Things like traffic are sort of a minor concern at most because, frankly, there isn't much in their town. And in that case, it's important to dig out all of the studies which show that parking reform, especially things like removing minimum parking regulations, is actually really helpful for economic revival, and that it can help bring businesses back. And then if you work in other places, for example, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, especially in recent years, people are saying, well, we have plenty of jobs. We have jobs coming out our ears. What we want is relief from traffic. And so you could show the reasons why these policies really help to reduce traffic congestion. So figuring out what the top priorities are is really important. One thing I virtually always find is that environmentalists understand the benefits almost immediately. And so it's usually not really that useful to spend a lot of time pointing out the environmental benefits because those people are already generally in favor of making these kinds of reforms. In most areas, it will be either the local residents, say the neighborhood association, or the local business and property owners who really matter. But one thing I should mention is that there are different levels of government where parking reform can take place. And oftentimes, minimum parking regulations were put in place originally, oftentimes because the curb parking in an area filled up. People started circling in search of free curb parking, or they started double parking. And people said, well, that's a problem. Let's solve this by requiring every private property owner to build a big parking lot. It was a very local problem, and it got a response that caused a lot of problems that are regional or even statewide or nationwide. Problems like more motor vehicle trips, greater regional traffic congestion, higher housing prices, lots of unintended consequences. And so sometimes the opportunity for reform is at the local level. But actually, I've been seeing a lot of places where reform has taken place at the state or the national level.
there have been attempts at that in California, but have there been successful moves on that in other states? Or
They have actually. They often haven't gotten that much attention, but there have been numerous bills that have gone successfully through the California legislature lately and become state law, which implement parking reform. So, for example, there was one bill a few years back that limits the amount of parking that can be required for new affordable housing. So I believe that in most cases, local jurisdictions are no longer allowed to require more than half a parking space for each affordable housing unit.
and there was another one for accessory dwelling units, right? What we call granny flats.
Right. That was another bill. So California, quite a few years ago, passed a law that said that every city must allow accessory dwelling units to be built. So many of the cities created ordinances that allowed this, but only under very restrictive conditions, including oftentimes requiring that more parking be built for the new little granny flat. The state legislature a couple years ago came in and said, well, in most places, you're no longer allowed to require more parking. And then this last year, a bill was passed that said, now you can actually convert your existing garage into an accessory dwelling unit. You then, in addition, you don't have to build any new parking for it. And then another bill said, well, in addition to that, you can also add a junior accessory dwelling unit. So actually now you can effectively build a triplex on most lots in California that previously only allowed a single family house.
And so then that draws the attention of perhaps people who are worried about the impacts of this on parking to the on-street parking and how to manage it. And I know you have some interesting ideas on being very pragmatic about how to manage parking in residential streets when there is infill happening. Could you talk about that a little bit, and ideally offer an example of somewhere where this is working well?
Sure. So the classic problem that we see is that cities will want to manage curb parking in a residential area, and so they will usually here in the United States implement residential parking permits, basically a system where if you're a resident in the area, you can get parking permits that allow you to park on the street. In the past, it was usually some kind of plastic sticker that you stuck on your bumper. The first mistake that was often made by cities is that they would issue more parking permits than there were spaces. So, for example, in the Beacon Hill neighborhood in Boston, I think they issued close to 4,000 parking permits. When they went back and counted, they discovered there were less than 1,000 curb parking spaces.
Oops. Yeah.
Yeah. So they made the permits free. They gave out an unlimited number, and it basically was just a hunting license. So the first thing is that eventually you need to get to a point where you are not issuing more than one permit for every curb parking space. Better than that, you want to get to a point where in residential areas you have at least one or two empty spaces on each block most of the time. So there's a few ways to do this, and which one makes most sense for your neighborhood will often depend on local politics and priorities. I mean, one possibility in residential areas is to simply charge the right price for curb parking and return the revenue to the neighborhood to create public improvements. The difficulty with that usually is that you have lots of residents who parked for free on their street for 30 or 40 years, and they say, well, I've always parked for free in front of my house, and I don't want to pay to park in front of my house. So one really pragmatic approach is just to say that for all the current residents, we're going to allow you to get a permit to park on the street for free. And in fact, we'll give you one for every car that you're currently parking on the street. And then you can say, though, for new residents to this area and for people who don't live in the neighborhood, those people are going to be charged. And those future people will charge them the rate needed to make sure that spaces stay available. So a lot of times at first what'll happen is there's no improvement other than probably fewer non-residents parking in the area. But then over time, what'll happen is that people turn in their permits as they move away and sell their house, or in an apartment area, they stop renting there. And so over time, gradually, the number of permits and circulations will be reduced.
Yeah. Can you name some places that have actually done that and it making a difference?
Yeah, one really interesting place is Tucson, Arizona. In Tucson, they have some residential parking permit districts that they set up near the university. They used to have the usual problem of the university charged for parking, but the street parking was free and unregulated, and so all of the students would park in the neighborhood. So, and what they did is they said, for this parking permit system, we're going to give out no more than one permit for every curb parking space that is actually available in front of a property. For example, let's say you have a 50-foot wide lot and 10 feet of that is driveway, so that leaves two 20-foot long curb parking spaces in front of your property. In that case, your property can only get a maximum of two parking permits. And if you decide that you're going to rent your house to 20 college students who all pack in there and they have 20 cars, well, sorry, they still only get two permits, and the other 18 students are either going to have to find a place to park on the property, or else they're going to have to park somewhere else, but they won't be dumping all those cars on the street. That's a way that is widely perceived as fair because it's really matching the number of parking spaces that you actually have in front of your property to the number of permits you get. It has a great advantage when you're thinking about, or when you are allowing more housing to be built in a neighborhood. So suppose somebody tears down a single family house and they put up, say, a courtyard apartment building with a dozen apartments. Ordinarily, with a lot of permit systems, the neighbors would oppose the new housing because they'd say, well, we're afraid that the 12 new apartments are going to dump a lot more cars on the street. In this situation, the property owner still only gets issued two parking permits because there's still only two parking spaces in front of that property. And so now that property owner can decide, well, do I want to build some off-street parking with this courtyard apartment so that I'll actually be able to lease these apartments to people who own cars and want to be able to park on the property.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So that also overcomes this problem that it seems unfair that, existing residents get free parking and new ones have to pay, whereas this one is more sort of even-handed in that respect.
Yeah, it's a useful solution here in California too, because in California, the Attorney General has said you can't discriminate in issuing residential parking permits based on the type of dwelling unit. So they say you can't, for example, say no permits for people who live in apartments, but we are going to give permits to people who live in single-family houses. But this way, you're just saying, well, if there are two spaces in front of a property, you can have two permits, and doesn't discriminate on that basis.
I'm slightly worried that it might backfire, that people then have the sense that the parking in front of their lot is theirs in some sense.
Yes.
Did that happen as well? Or
I think in reality it hasn't been a problem because people realize that it's not tied to a particular parking spot on the street in the neighborhood. It simply says if you have two parking spaces in front of your property, then you can have two permits that are good to park basically anywhere within that permit district. It's interesting because some people certainly will say, well, it just doesn't seem fair that under this system, if somebody only has a single family house on their property, that they get two permits, whereas if there's a big apartment building built on the same property, that you don't get one permit for every single apartment. But you can sort of see that adding more homes to a property doesn't result in the creation of more parking spaces on the street. The thing is, though, that it's only one approach. It is not going to be the approach that every town will go for.
Do you have much experience with the push to unbundle parking? So, for example, if people rent or buy a housing unit in an apartment, say, the parking should be sold or rented separately, so you have a choice of whether or not to rent or buy parking along with your house. I know San Francisco mandates that. Do you think it's something that needs to be mandated, or is it something that happens as a market phenomenon if we do the other reforms that we've been talking about?
It's something that eventually tends to happen as a result of removing minimum parking regulations, but it's not something that always happens. And it's particularly something that doesn't always happen in areas that are just beginning to change from being very suburban and auto dependent to more urban places. So it's really useful to actually pass an ordinance that requires the unbundling of parking costs from the rent for apartments or from the sale price.
Yeah, one detail of that people have asked online is, do you need to set a minimum price somehow? Like I can imagine some developer that is forced to unbundle but doesn't really want to would say, okay, it's $1 or something.
Right, right. Yeah, San Francisco hasn't set a minimum price, and for the most part, that hasn't been a problem.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it might be a better ordinance if we did set a minimum price that was higher than what's often being charged. Currently in San Francisco, though, there's often fees of at least close to the cost of actually building and operating the space. There are times where the price might be only, say, half of what it's actually costing, and that's largely because, for historic reasons, because San Francisco used to have minimum parking regulations, we actually built a lot more parking in this city than would have been built under market conditions, and that's driven the price lower. There are other places where I think it is useful to have a minimum price. So, for example, Bellevue, Washington is a place where they passed an ordinance that requires the unbundling of parking costs from commercial leases.
Uh-huh.
So if you're a building owner in downtown Bellevue, Washington, you are required by law to lease parking separately from office space. They set a minimum price, which was the price of a 2-zone bus pass. They have a zone-based pricing system for transit up there. So the last time I checked, the price was $135 a month in, I think it was 2017.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, that was remarkably successful. They were a pretty auto-dependent bedroom suburb. They had about 81% of commuters driving alone into downtown, and that dropped down to 57% in just a few years. That's about a 30% decline, nearly a third lower drive-alone commute rate.
Let's talk a little bit about, say, someone who's got a bee under their bonnet and they can see that parking policy in their town or suburb or downtown is so horribly wrong. They want to do something about it. They want to get some friends together and do something. On the last episode, I spoke with Lindsay and Jane from the Parking Reform Network, and one of the things we talked about was some of the do-it-yourself parking measurement exercises. You can count, do your own counts and do your own analysis. As a parking consultant, you know how to do that, but and I'm not sure whether you'd welcome the sort of the homemade competition, but yeah. So, but what do you think of that? Is that a valuable thing for parking advocates, reform advocates, to get going and to prod their city or their town into then hiring some real parking consultants to actually get some parking reform going?
Sometimes that can be a really good approach. I have known numerous advocates who have gone out and done that. So for example, they may want to show that they have that classic problem where the curb parking is all full, but the off-street parking is underused and there's a big surplus. And so they go out and do some counts and demonstrate that. There are quite a few students in recent years who have done parking occupancy counts in one town or several towns and done that as student research projects and then written a thesis on it. And over again, we'll see the same thing, that the curb parking is well used and overcrowded in many areas, and that the off-street parking is oversupplied and underused. Oftentimes that can be a really good driver of change. And it's the kind of thing where there are so many jurisdictions in need of parking reform that unless change happens at the state or national level, there's essentially a lifetime's worth of work to do for many people. I mean, actually, I think that in California and some other places, the most powerful reforms have occurred at the state or national level, and that's often taken far less effort given the results achieved. What we really find is that minimum parking regulations, they do so much damage in terms of increasing motor vehicle trips and pollution and increasing housing costs and undermining business, that those things can really be understood at the state or the national level. There are places like England where minimum parking requirements were very strongly discouraged at the national level, close to banned, and that had a huge impact. And then there are places like California where basically people have been chipping away at them by the various laws I mentioned earlier. For example, in California, passing the law that said you can't set high parking requirements for affordable housing, that affected some 550 cities and counties across this state of 40 million people. So that's a really fruitful avenue oftentimes.
I mentioned the Parking Reform Network just recently, and I believe you're a member of the advisory board. Is that correct?
Yes.
One of our missions last time with Jane and Lindsay was to encourage listeners to join the Parking Reform Network. What do you think of the Parking Reform Network? What motivates you to be part of it?
As I understand it, it began as a project of Tony Jordan's, and Tony is a well-respected transit advocate up in Portland who became a parking reform advocate when he realized that the city really wasn't doing a good job of reforming parking policy on its own. My understanding is that they had removed minimum parking regulations for private properties in quite a few areas, especially along transit lines. But there was a backlash when some new buildings got built without parking, and that caused some spillover parking problems onto nearby neighborhood streets. So he essentially got together, organized a group of people to really focus on establishing better parking policies. He got the city to drop the idea of reinstating the minimum parking requirements and instead to do a much better job managing the curb parking. And based on that successful advocacy work, he realized it only took a fairly small group of advocates forming a local reform organization to accomplish that, and that there was a lot of opportunity to do that in other cities around the country. And so he established the Parking Reform Network to really be a resource and assistant to people who want to start local parking reform groups. And so he's been really getting that off the ground and up and running. And based on all of his good work in Portland and the other parking reform groups that have started to spring up, I think he's going to do very well.
Yeah.
And that the group as a whole will do very well. I don't mean to forget all the board members like Lindsay who've been doing good work too.
Yeah, no, it's very encouraging, and it's great to see. And I'd like to see a similar thing in Australia, where I'm from, where there's a dire need for similar reforms. Yeah, it's really great to be able to network with others around who've had similar experiences, and it lowers the barrier to entry and the reduces how daunting it feels to take action if you can get advice from someone who's been there, done that, and faced the same objections, the same barriers, the same obstacles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one really good resource that I would recommend to everyone is Donald Shoup has edited a new book called Parking in the City. And Parking in the City, which, Paul, if I remember right, did you contribute a chapter?
Yes, I've got a chapter in there about Asian cities.
That's right. So Parking in the City, for our listeners, is a book which begins with an introduction by Professor Shoup, where he essentially gives an abbreviated version of his previous book, The High Cost of Free Parking, which really describes a lot of these parking reform techniques. And then there are several dozen chapters by a whole group of authors, including you and me and many others, that really describe a lot of the success stories, how it happened, what the benefits were of various reforms. So there's chapters in there about SF Park. There are a couple chapters about Ventura. There's a lot of good stuff in there for people who really neat examples of where these ideas have been implemented on the ground.
Yes, yeah, I'd certainly agree. And I believe Donald Shoup has made his introductory chapter a free download from his website, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think you're right.
I will double check that, and I'll put it in the show notes, the blog post that goes with this episode, and help point people towards that book, because yes, it is an excellent resource, and a little less daunting than the original 2005 High Cost of Free Parking, which is 600 pages. It's a very readable 600 pages, and it has inspired a lot of us, but a little daunting for a beginner.
Yes, it is. But it's a remarkably useful reference. I actually was just digging through it the other day because I was building a parking supply and demand and cost and revenue model for the city of Davis, and I had to go back and remind myself what the proper equations are for parking price elasticity of demand in various circumstances, and for that level of technical depth, it's just what you need.
Just thinking about the future, do you see parking reform having significant momentum, or is it stuck in a rut? Is there something that we need to do to shake it up and get it moving again?
It does have significant momentum because a number of factors are coming together, and they're steadily piling up one on top of the other. So the first thing is that the research demonstrating the harmful impacts of status quo parking policies has really piled up. So there's more and more research now showing that minimum parking requirements are harmful in all sorts of ways. And there's more and more research showing that pricing curb parking properly and returning the revenue to the neighborhoods to make it popular, that is popular and effective and solves lots of problems. So that research base is really, really helpful for all the staff. Probably equally important is that cities often look around to see what their peers are doing, and more their peers they can see are removing minimum parking requirements. They're sometimes citywide, sometimes in just certain districts, but they can see that's happening, and they can see the benefits. There are more and more young people coming into the profession who were trained and actually taught something about how to manage parking well on the street, and so a lot of those people are replacing a lot of the baby boomers like me who are either retired or will be gone within a few years. So all of these factors come together, and then the last thing is that the factors on the ground are changing. So it's everything from the seriousnose of climate change to cities' desire to revitalize local economies, to things like the rise of ride-sharing operations, ride-hailing operations like Lyft and Uber, that are really cutting into parking demand and making it even more obvious that we're requiring too much parking. So you put these things all together, and I see lots and lots of momentum.
Yeah, I think you're right. And on the international level, it's patchy, but it certainly helps people in various other countries to be able to point to the fact that the home of car dependence, the United States, is at least in some places shifting on this issue of parking. So it's encouraging.
Yes, absolutely. There's reforms happening in cities all across the United States, and at the state level in many states, and then of course major cities all over the world have either gotten rid of their minimum parking requirements or are on the way. So whether it's London or Rio or Sao Paulo or Mexico City or Buffalo, New York, San Francisco, they've all completely gotten rid of their off-street parking requirements.
That's right. Recently, Edmonton in Canada, which is significant because I think the city municipality covers a pretty big percentage of the metro area. So that's a new one.
Yeah, it's remarkable, especially since it's the heart of their oil and gas industry.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So Patrick, it's been great talking to you. I've really enjoyed having this conversation, and I always expect to be sort of hashing over the same old issues, but I've learned quite a few things from you today, so I hope the listeners will enjoy it too.
Well, I'm glad I could tell you at least a few new things. I know that you have deep expertise in this topic as well, and I've really enjoyed our conversation too. So it's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Patrick. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.